October 1943. A formation of B-17 Flying Fortresses cruises at 25,000 feet above Germany. Each bomber bristles with 1350 caliber Browning machine guns. In combat box formation, the group presents over 100 heavy machine guns to any attacker from virtually any angle. German fighter pilots learned to dread the approach. From 2,000 yards out, American gunners opened fire. Red tracers filled the sky. For the next several minutes, Luftwaffe pilots flew through a storm of half-inch projectiles, traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, while their own weapons remained hopelessly out of range. The gun creating this nightmare was designed in 1918. By the time Germany invaded Poland, it was already 20 years old, and in 6 years of war, German engineering never found an answer to it. This is the story of the M2 Browning. The weapon traces its origins to a cable sent from France in April 1918. General John J. Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Force, urgently requested a machine gun of not less than half-an-inch caliber with a muzzle velocity of at least 2,700 feet per second. German Junkers J.I. ground attack aircraft, armored in steel plate, had rendered the standard .30 caliber machine gun ineffective. Something dramatically bigger was needed. John Moses Browning, already the most prolific firearms designer in American history, began scaling up his proven M1917 .30 caliber design around July 1917 at Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company. He worked alongside colleague Fred T. Moore, while Winchester Repeating Arms simultaneously developed the cartridge. Critical inspiration came from captured German 13.2mm anti-tank rifle rounds that achieved the velocity Pershing demanded. The resulting .50 Browning machine gun round delivered roughly 12,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, 4 times that of the .30-06 Springfield. A single projectile could punch through a 1/4 inch of armor plate at 600 yards. The first prototype fired on October 15, 1918, less than a month before the armistice. Initial results disappointed. The gun managed fewer than 500 rounds per minute with a muzzle velocity of only 2,300 feet per second. But the war ended, and what followed was something that would prove decisive 20 years later. Peacetime refinement. Between 1927 and 1932, Dr. Samuel G. Green of the U.S. Ordnance Corps redesigned the M1921 into a single universal receiver configurable into 7 weapon types. Every flaw identified in testing was corrected, every weakness addressed. The M2 designation was adopted in 1933, and the ANM2 aircraft variant was standardized on October 5th of that year. By the time war erupted in Europe, the M2 was the most thoroughly debugged weapon system in the American arsenal. What critics called an old design was in fact an enormous advantage. The slow peacetime refinement process had produced a weapon of extraordinary mechanical reliability that needed no wartime redesign. General Henry Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, declared in 1943 that the Browning was the outstanding aircraft gun of the Second World War, crediting the Ordnance Department for bringing it to such a state of perfection during the years of peace prior to the present conflict. The ANM2 aircraft variant was a marvel of optimization for aerial combat. Weighing 61 pounds with a shorter 36-inch barrel cooled by slipstream, it achieved a cyclic rate of 750 to 850 rounds per minute. It was roughly 60% faster than the ground-mounted heavy barrel variant. It fired from a solenoid trigger for remote operation and could be synchronized to fire through propeller arcs. When the United States Army Air Forces loaded 6 or 8 of these guns into fighter wings, the result was a volume of fire without parallel in aerial combat. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 ANM2 Brownings with up to 3,400 rounds of ammunition. Combined, these weapons produced approximately 100 rounds per second. A 5-second burst placed roughly 500 projectiles into a 3-by-3-foot target area at 1,100 feet. The recoil alone slowed the aircraft by 20 to 30 miles per hour. P-47. Thunderbolts destroyed over 3,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat in the European theater, plus 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. The type achieved a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. The North American P-51 Mustang carried 650 caliber guns with approximately 1,880 rounds, delivering around 80 rounds per second. Mustangs destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the air over Europe and over 4,000 on the ground. The P-51's arrival enabled deep escort missions into Germany that reversed catastrophic bomber losses. Before the Mustang, 8th Air Force bomber units experienced a 77% overall casualty rate. By D-Day, Allied air supremacy was so complete that only 2 German aircraft responded to the Normandy invasion. The philosophy behind this armament was deliberate: volume over destructive power per round. American fighters primarily fought other fighters, Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, where hit probability mattered more than individual round lethality. With flat trajectory, high-velocity rounds fired at rates exceeding 4,800 rounds per minute combined, American fighters created what pilots called a wall of lead. The .50 caliber's additional advantage was ammunition capacity. A P-47 pilot had roughly 35 seconds of trigger time compared to about 8 to 10 seconds for a British Typhoon with 4 20mm cannons carrying only 480 rounds. For the majority of pilots, who were not seasoned marksmen, more rounds meant more chances to connect. If you are finding this deep dive interesting, consider subscribing. It takes a second and helps the channel grow. Now, back to what happened when German pilots tried to answer the .50 caliber. Germany's failure to develop a weapon matching the M2 Browning was not a failure of capability. It was a failure of doctrine. The Luftwaffe faced a fundamentally different tactical problem than the USAAF. American fighters hunted other fighters, where volume of fire mattered most. German fighters hunted 4-engine heavy bombers, where explosive shells were essential to bring them down quickly. This asymmetry drove Germany toward heavy cannon and away from the intermediate caliber machine gun class entirely. The consequences proved catastrophic. The closest German equivalent was the Rhine metal MG-131, a 13mm weapon introduced in 1940. Despite being 0.3 of a millimeter wider in caliber than the .50 BMG, it was a substantially weaker weapon. Its shorter cartridge case held far less propellant, yielding a muzzle velocity of 750 meters per second versus the M2's 890 meters per second. Its 34-gram projectile carried roughly 9,600 joules of energy, about 60% of the .50 BMG's 16,250 joules. British testing found the MG-131's small explosive filler had fuses that were too sensitive to be effective, detonating on thin outer aircraft skin before reaching fuel tanks or structural members. The MG-131 was designed as a compact replacement for the 7.92mm MG-17 that could fit in the same restricted nose spaces, not as a competitor to the M2 Browning. Germany's primary answer to Allied bomber formations was the MG-15 120mm autocannon, firing devastating mine shells containing 18 grams of explosive. It was arguably the best 20mm aircraft cannon of the war by weight efficiency metrics, and it required approximately 15 to 20 hits to bring down a B-17. But it carried far less ammunition than the .50 caliber, a critical limitation in the fast-closing engagements that characterized air combat. The most extreme response was the Rhine metal Mk108, a 30mm cannon that could destroy a B-17 with just 3 to 4 hits. But the Mk108 epitomized the trade-offs of Germany's heavy cannon philosophy. Its muzzle velocity was an astonishingly low 540 meters per second, barely faster than some pistol cartridges. This produced 41 meters of bullet drop at 1,000 meters. Effective range was under 600 meters. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown, who flew captured Me-262 jets after the war, described the challenge bluntly. You normally came in at 600 yards and would open fire on your B-17. Your closing speed was still high. You only had 2 seconds firing time. In 2 seconds, you cannot sight. You can fire randomly and hope for the best. The Mk-108 was also prone to ammunition feed jamming, a documented problem on the Me-262 jet fighter that carried 4 of them. Perhaps the most revealing evidence that Germany's gap was deliberate. From mid-1940, Germany controlled the Belgian FN factory, which actively manufactured the 50 BMG under license. They could have had a 50 caliber weapon. They chose not to. As weapons historian Ian McCollum explained, everyone faced the choice of a 50 caliber machine gun or 20 millimeter cannons for anti-aircraft use, and most people chose the cannons, including Germany. The American M2's ubiquity was partly a logistical artifact of interwar production momentum. But that accident of history proved decisive. The psychological weight of the 50 caliber on German forces is documented through pilot accounts, tactical reforms, and increasingly desperate engineering responses. The M2's superior muzzle velocity and range meant Luftwaffe pilots approaching American bomber formations entered a kill zone of tracer fire minutes before they could return fire effectively. A psychologically crushing experience. Karl Boris of Jagdgeschwader 26 described how the bomber gunners opened fire as soon as targets were spotted. The Americans' Browning 50 caliber machine guns had a higher muzzle velocity and a greater range than the Germans' MG-17s. So the fighter pilots' cockpits were surrounded by red tracers, swarming like wasps, long before they themselves could open fire effectively. And because of low closing speeds, this extremely uncomfortable situation could continue for several minutes. Some pilots would invariably break away prematurely. This psychological pressure drove immediate tactical innovation. In November 1942, German ace Egon Mayer systematically analyzed B-17 defensive fire arcs and devised the head-on attack, exploiting the bomber's weakest firing position. Adolf Galland, as General der Jagdflieger, circulated new tactical regulations based on Mayer's findings, explicitly stating, "The attack from the rear against a 4-engined bomber formation promises little success and almost always brings losses." The United States Army Air Forces countered by adding the twin 50 caliber chin turret to the B-17G model, and the arms race continued. The most dramatic German adaptation was the Sturmbach program, a battering ram. Engineers added approximately 200 kilograms of armor to Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, specifically to survive 50 caliber fire during bomber formation attacks. This included 5mm steel Panzerplatten on fuselage sides, 30mm armored glass panels on canopy sides, and up to 20mm armored plate behind the pilot's head. The result was an aircraft so heavy and sluggish that it required separate Messerschmitt 109 escorts to protect it from Allied fighters. Pilots described the armored Focke-Wulf 190 as a lumbering old cow across the skies. Sturmgruppe pilots signed contracts committing to shoot down at least 1 bomber per mission or ram it if necessary. Pilots returning without a kill could face court-martial. The fundamental paradox was inescapable. If armor was increased to survive 50 caliber fire on the bomber approach, the aircraft became helpless against escort fighters. If armor was reduced, the bomber's defensive fire tore it apart. This unsolvable dilemma was a direct product of the M2 Browning's effectiveness. On the ground, the 50 caliber earned names German troops learned to dread. The M45 quad mount mounted 4 M2HB heavy barrel Brownings on an electrically powered platform that could traverse 360 degrees, carried on M16 half-tracks. Combined, these weapons delivered 2,200 rounds per minute, with 800 rounds immediately ready in tombstone ammunition chests. American troops called it the meat chopper, the Kraut mower. Each armored division included M16 half-tracks in its anti-aircraft company, but Allied air supremacy meant these weapons increasingly served a ground support role. During the Battle of the Bulge, quad mounts cut through German infantry attacks with horrifying efficiency. A .50 caliber round remained lethal at half a mile and penetrated virtually any cover, from trees to walls to light vehicles. When snipers occupied trees, crews engaged at trunk level, cutting down entire trees along with their occupants. At the Rhine crossing at Oppenheim in March 1945, Germany sent 248 warplanes to destroy the bridge, enabling Patton's Third Army to cross. Massed M45 quad mounts shot down approximately 30% of the attacking force. The bridge stood. The most famous individual M2 action belonged to 2nd Lieutenant Odie Murphy near Holtzwihr, France, on January 26, 1945. Facing 6 German tanks and approximately 250 infantry, the 19-year-old climbed atop a burning M10 tank destroyer and manned its turret-mounted .50 caliber Browning for over an hour. He killed or wounded roughly 50 German soldiers as they advanced to within 10 yards of his position. Hit in one leg, he continued firing until the ammunition was exhausted, then organized a counterattack. The action earned him the Medal of Honor. The M2HB was also standard equipment on M4 Sherman tanks, mounted on the turret roof. Though exposing the tank commander to use it was dangerous, its ability to penetrate engine blocks, half-track armor, and concrete emplacements made it invaluable in urban combat and against fortified positions. Military histories note that the weapon was particularly hated by the Germans, whose attacks and ambushes against otherwise helpless stalled motor convoys were frequently broken up by .50 caliber machine gun fire. The M2's battlefield dominance was inseparable from the industrial capacity that produced it. The United States manufactured approximately 2 million .50 caliber M2 Brownings during the war. Roughly 350,000 were M2HB ground guns, and the remainder were AN-M2 aircraft variants. General Motors alone contributed over 1.2 million Browning machine guns through 4 divisions: AC Sparkplug, Frigidaire, Brown-Lipe Chapin, and Saginaw steering gear. The ammunition supply chain was equally vast. The St. Louis Ordnance Plant alone delivered 6.7 billion rounds of .30 caliber and .50 caliber combined. In April 1945, AAF units in the European and Mediterranean theaters fired nearly 25 million rounds of machine gun and cannon ammunition in a single month. The vast majority were .50 caliber. The 8th Air Force alone expended 76.9 million rounds of .50 caliber during the war, accounting for 6,098 enemy aircraft destroyed. This production scale reflected a strategic decision unique to the United States. Where Germany employed roughly 10 different aircraft armament types and Japan used approximately 20, America standardized on a single weapon. The same 50 BMG cartridge-fed fighter guns, bomber turrets, tank-mounted weapons, anti-aircraft batteries, and infantry-heavy machine guns. This logistical simplification, one caliber, one weapon system across all branches, was enormously powerful. Combined with a wartime unit cost of approximately $750 per gun and an ammunition supply measured in billions, the M2 represented the intersection of adequate technology and overwhelming industrial capacity that defined American warmaking. The M2 Browning's story upends conventional assumptions about military technology. The weapon that dominated World War II aerial battlespace was not the newest or most technically sophisticated. It was the most mature, most reliable, and most abundantly produced. Germany's Mk108 cannon was 5 times more destructive per kilogram of weapon weight. The MG150-120 was roughly twice as efficient as the .50 caliber Browning in firepower to weight ratios. But these advantages evaporated against the M2's combination of volume, reliability, ammunition capacity, and industrial scale. The German failure was real but nuanced. It was not that Germany lacked the engineering capability to build a 50 caliber weapon. They literally controlled an FN factory that manufactured them. It was that their doctrine demanded heavy cannon to counter Allied bombers, trapping them in an escalation spiral of ever heavier, shorter-ranged, less reliable weapons, while neglecting the versatile intermediate caliber that the Americans deployed everywhere. The Mk-108's theoretical lethality meant nothing when pilots had 2 seconds to fire and the rounds went wide. The Sturmbach's armor saved pilots from 50 caliber fire only to leave them defenseless against the escort fighters, those same Brownings armed. The M2 Browning remains in active military service today, over 107 years after its first prototype firing. So little has changed that a World War I doughboy could sit behind a modern M2 and immediately know how to operate it. The Bundeswehr now equips its NH-90 helicopters with the FNM-3M, a direct descendant of the weapon that once terrorized their predecessors. John Browning designed a gun to defeat armored German aircraft in 1918. It took 6 years for his design to prove itself over the skies of Europe. It took Germany 6 more years to admit they had no answer. That was American engineering. That was the 50 caliber. If this moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive.